I'm frequently asked, what should mediators think of first when dealing with conflict?
David, what are we...
Shut up.
You shut up.
You shut up.
So your oldest sibling has asked for help in mediating with your parents over her decision not to get married in the Catholic Church. The other members of the town council have nominated you to mediate a dispute between members of the school board on testing and quarantine protocols for COVID-19 in the school district. Or you've just begun mediating in a local small claims court once a month after completing your required mediation training program in your jurisdiction. Whether you mediate informally or more professionally, if you're interested in improving your skill and effectiveness when you're called upon to mediate, and you want to know what you should be considering when dealing with conflict, stay tuned. Because in this video, I will share with you 4 key considerations a mediator should have when dealing with a conflict situation. And if you stick around to the end, you'll hear me discuss one of the hot, controversial issues in our mediation field. So the first question I ask myself is, to what extent can I be curious about the narrative and interests of all of the parties in the conflict? My professional capacity as a mediator, I typically find it's really easy to be interested in the stories of all the parties. That is a good thing since it's a big part of my work as a mediator. But there are times when I might be asked to mediate a conflict between friends or family, or in an organization in which I'm involved, where it can be harder for me to be curious because, frankly, I already have a strong view about who's right and who is wrong. And when that's the case, a good mediator will be direct, and they'll simply say, I'm honored you thought of me. I don't think I'm particularly well suited to mediate in this particular conflict. And to be honest, there is no shame in that. That's part of being good at your craft. Related to this question of curiosity, part of what you want to be asking is, can I be a good listener here and ask lots of curious questions of the parties? Or do I just feel predisposed to one side or another in a way that will make me less effective as a mediator and more apt to favor one side or the other? This kind of self-diagnosis or examination is the first thing a mediator should be considering when they're introduced to a conflict. The second question you should consider is, would all sides see me as trustworthy and an honest broker if I were mediating the case? Note how I phrase this question. It is not, can I be a trustworthy and honest broker? The answer to that question is connected to your answer about being interested and curious about all sides. This question is about perception. Will the others see you as a trustworthy and honest broker? If the answer to this question is no, then it's important to decline the invitation or the opportunity to mediate. Let me give you a few examples. Some years ago, I was serving on the board of a nonprofit organization. Before serving on that board, I had worked closely with members of the staff on several major programs, getting to know some staff members really well and even developing friendships with them. Now, early into my tenure on the board, a dispute had arisen between some members of the board and some members of the staff. Various members of the board nominating me to be a suitable mediator because of my relationships on both sides of the conflict. And to be honest, I was really touched by the trust placed in me here. But I also knew that, despite the friendships I had with members of the staff, agreeing to serve as a mediator would be perceived as an act of betrayal, and that my efforts, well-intentioned or maybe even skillful, would have been in vain. They would have backfired. Unfortunately, because mediators are human, we often overestimate our ability to be perceived as a fair and honest broker. This is partially because we suffer from self-serving biases, as all human beings do. It's also because sometimes a failure of our own ability to perspective take or understand how the parties perceive us is in place. So let me give you an example from the real world that involves the Middle East Quartet. So this was 4 parties, the United States, the United Nations, the European Union, and Russia, who came together in 2002 to help mediate the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. In 2007, they appointed Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, as the special envoy to this quartet. They appointed him on the day he resigned as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Now, quite apart from the diplomatic or mediation skill that a statesman like Prime Minister Blair may have had, I always thought that there was a really low chance he'd be successful as a mediator in this conflict. So the reason why Tony Blair I didn't think was going to succeed isn't because this is a really hard international conflict that has gotten worse over decades, although that is clearly true. Rather, it was about the choice of Blair himself. You see, Tony Blair was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom when the United States, along with the United Kingdom and other countries, started a war with Iraq. Now, you might be thinking, like, what does that have to do with mediating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And I would say a lot. And here's why. Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, was one of the few Arab states that supported in a whole way the Palestinian cause. When Blair has his country invade Iraq and depose Saddam Hussein, that immediately, in the eyes of the Palestinians, made him seem as a non-neutral, biased enemy of the Palestinian people. So whatever skill, whatever good statesmanship you or me or others might have thought Tony Blair has generally, in this particular mediation, at least as perceived by one of the two parties, there was no way he could have been seen as neutral. And of course, as we know, Tony Blair was not successful in this role. The third question a mediator should ask themselves is this situation ripe and appropriate for mediation? So whenever I'm approached to mediate, a question I am always assessing is, are the parties actually ready for a mediator? So to me, ripeness and appropriateness are related, but a bit different. So let me first talk about ripeness. Ripeness goes to the question of whether the parties to a dispute are really ready to mediate. It's particularly relevant in situations where someone might be pressuring one or both sides to get to the mediation table. For example, forcing parties to mediate at a moment when there are very strong emotions, or when one or both sides still feels like they can beat the other side by means other than mediation, might suggest that the situation isn't quite ripe for mediation. It's not that both sides need to be yearning for mediation in order for it to work, but if the parties are pushed or cajoled and have no real interest at all because they're too angry or upset or they're fixed on vanquishing the other side, the mediation is really less likely to work. So in my view, mediation ripeness isn't discussed enough amongst most mediation scholars, but I think it's really important. Too often people just say, oh, isn't it great there with a mediator? And I think like that might be good, but my worry is that if the parties aren't ready yet, forcing them into this will do more harm than good. Now, appropriateness is related to, but actually different from ripeness. Those of you who are waiting to hear more about the hot, controversial topic of mediation, this is it. By appropriate, what I mean is whether a particular conflict ought to be mediated at all. There are some in the mediation field who believe that it is inappropriate for certain cases to be mediated, even if the parties want it to be mediated. Specifically, their concern is if there are historic power differences in place, sending those parties in a conflict into a mediation could result in one side getting exploited where the power differential replicates itself in the mediation. For example, there are some who believe strongly that any mediation related to sexual harassment or assault is inappropriate on its face. They argue that structural, interpersonal, and emotional and power dynamics in play make mediation inappropriate. Others raise serious concerns about mediation in a divorce context where perhaps a troubling pattern involving huge power differences that played out throughout the marriage might play out again in the mediation. Within the academic literature, scholars have a range of different views on these issues. For the purposes of today, I'm going to avoid them. Personally, I am someone who is not prone to automatically exclude any kind of a conflict from a mediation. However, I do think skillful mediators ought to be carefully assessing situations where there might be power differentials, external pressure, fear, economic disparity, or other factors that can cause a red flag or concern about the appropriateness of mediation in that context. Lastly, assuming you've decided that the situation is both appropriate and ripe for mediation, that you can be impartial, that you'll be perceived as such, the final important consideration you should have is how to explain what your role will be to the parties in a way that they'll understand. This step is really important because when parties reach out to a mediator, they actually have typically no sense of what your role will be. Some of them think, the mediator is going to help me show how the other side is wrong and I'm right. Others think the mediator is going to render a decision or evaluate the merits of the case. And the truth is, none of these are accurate assessments of what a mediator actually does. So depending on the context and the parties involved, it's important for you to consider how to manage expectations and be clear about your role. Many years ago, I had a chance to mediate a conflict between members of a church that was slated to be closed and the diocesan officials who were closing it because they had decided that the church had become financially impractical and that they couldn't make the needed repairs to the building for this small and shrinking community to continue. So members of the church who had been involved in the dispute invited me in to meet with the larger church community. I thought I had done an incredibly clear job of being clear to both the diocese and the small group of leadership in the church about what my role might be. Imagine my feeling then that as I'm getting introduced to a auditorium of parishioners, I hear the small leader of the parish community say, "And now please welcome Bob Bordone, who is here to help us save our parish." My heart sunk. That was decidedly not what I was going to do. I was there to mediate. Suffice to say, this was one to grow on for me. So if you're new to mediating, it's easy to just feel super excited when you have a chance to practice your craft. And I confess, I still get excited and feel really thankful when people reach out to me. At the same time you feel that adrenaline rush though, you need to be thinking about, first, are you open and able to be curious? Second, can you be an honest broker? Third, will the parties see you as a credible and honest broker? Fourth, is this a situation that is both ripe and appropriate for mediation? And finally, how will you describe your role so that all the parties understand what you're going to do and what your role in the process will be? If you want to learn more about negotiation, mediation, difficult conversations, please keep watching these videos or reach out to me at the Cambridge Negotiation Institute, where I teach lots and lots of classes. Plus, I have another video for you, which is what are the qualities of a good mediator? So thanks for hanging out, and let's keep negotiating together. Here's that video, learn how to be a good mediator.